Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the autumn of 1839, a peculiar discovery disrupted the quiet rhythm of Savannah's historic district. A well-dressed gentleman was seen staggering down Abercorn Street at dawn, his wrists bearing unusual markings that resembled rope burns. According to the records kept by the Savannah Municipal Archives, the man identified himself as Thomas Wright, a businessman from Charleston, but refused to explain his injuries. What made this incident particularly strange was that Wright disappeared the very next day, leaving behind his luggage at the Planter's Inn, including several personal letters addressed to a Madame E. The innkeeper noted that Wright had been in Savannah for nearly 3 weeks, yet had rarely been seen at night. When city constables inquired at the addresses mentioned in Wright's documents, they found residents who claimed never to have heard of him. The constable's report, filed on October 12th, concluded simply, "Matter unresolved due to lack of evidence and complainant's departure." This might have remained just another odd footnote in Savannah's history, except for what would be discovered almost a century later in the basement of the Harwood estate. The Harwood estate stood approximately 4 miles outside Savannah's city limits, along what is now Highway 17. Built in 1823 by cotton merchant Franklin Harwood, the mansion was considered modest by plantation standards, but what distinguished the property was its carefully maintained appearance and the impeccable reputation of its mistress after Franklin's death in 1835. Elizabeth Harwood, born Elizabeth Caldwell, had arrived in Savannah from Richmond, Virginia, in 1819, the daughter of a respected judge. Her marriage to Franklin Harwood was described in the society pages of the Savannah Republican as a union of compatible temperaments and mutual advantage. By all accounts, Elizabeth was the model of Southern propriety, educated, charitable, and devoted to maintaining her late husband's legacy. County records show that after her husband's death, Elizabeth continued to manage the estate with remarkable efficiency. Production reports filed with cotton brokers in 1836 through 1841 show consistent yields despite a regional downturn. What neighbors and business associates noted, according to journal entries and correspondence preserved by the Georgia Historical Society, was Elizabeth's unfailing composure. Reverend James Whitaker of St. John's Episcopal Church wrote in his personal diary, "Mrs. Harwood bears her widowhood with such grace that one might think she had been preparing for solitude her entire life. She receives visitors seldom and ventures into society only when decorum demands it." The Reverend's observation, while meant as praise, would later take on a more disturbing connotation. Elizabeth's routine rarely varied. Twice monthly, she would visit Savannah to attend church, make necessary purchases, and occasionally dine with a small circle of acquaintances, mostly older married couples or widows like herself. According to the household ledgers preserved in the University of Georgia archives, these trips coincided with her overseer's visits to the cotton factors. Elizabeth would typically stay one night at her modest townhouse on Oglethorpe Square before returning to the plantation. What few people knew was that Elizabeth maintained a separate account with Johnson & Sons shipping agents, arranging for private deliveries from Charleston, New Orleans, and occasionally Europe. The manifests, discovered during a renovation of the Johnson building in 1947, listed items such as specialty hardware, medicinal supplies, and private library acquisitions. Nothing unusual for a woman of means, except for the frequency of these shipments and Elizabeth's insistence, noted in margin comments by the shipping clerk, that deliveries be made directly to her estate rather than her town residence. The summer of 1839 marked a subtle shift in Elizabeth's established patterns. According to church attendance records, she began to visit Savannah more frequently, sometimes staying for 3 or 4 days. The Plantation ledgers show that during these periods she left management to her overseer, Walter Mills, a man described in county employment records as competent but unremarkable. Elizabeth also began to receive male visitors at her townhouse, businessmen, according to her household staff, who came to discuss investments or property matters. One name that appears several times in the house servant's informal log is Thomas Wright. The servant, Mary Campbell, noted that Wright called upon Elizabeth 4 times in July of 1839. Campbell's observation, jotted in the margins of a kitchen inventory: mistress entertained Mr. Wright until very late, served tea at 11 o'clock, gentleman departed after midnight, looked unwell. This entry coincides with the same Thomas Wright, who would later be seen with mysterious injuries on Abercorn Street. The textile merchant Harold Green, whose shop stood across from Elizabeth's townhouse, mentioned in correspondence to his wife, who was visiting relatives in Augusta, that Mrs. Harwood has taken to entertaining gentlemen callers at hours that would raise eyebrows in less forgiving circles. Green's letter, dated August 17, 1839, continued, "Yesterday, a carriage arrived well after sundown, and a man I believe to be that cotton broker from Mississippi, Daniels or Davidson, entered her residence. The curtains remained drawn until morning, when the same carriage returned." Green's observations, while tinged with the judgmental tone common to the era, established a pattern that would later prove significant to investigators. The autumn of 1839 brought an unusual number of missing persons reports in Savannah and the surrounding counties. According to the fragmentary police records that survived the courthouse fire of 1856, at least 3 men of business standing were reported missing between September and December. Besides Thomas Wright, there was Jonathan Daniels, a cotton broker from Natchez, likely the same man observed by Harold Green, and Frederick Parsons, a widower from Augusta who had traveled to Savannah to settle his late brother's estate. In each case, the men had been in Savannah for several weeks before their disappearance, had no known enemies, and left behind personal effects in their lodgings. The constables, overwhelmed with more pressing criminal matters in the bustling port city, filed these cases away after cursory investigations yielded no results. What connected these disappearances to Elizabeth Harwood would not be discovered until 1963, when the Harwood estate, long abandoned and slated for demolition to make way for commercial development, was being surveyed by architects. According to the sworn statement of Robert Wilson, the lead surveyor, the discovery was made by accident. "We were assessing the foundation when Johnson, my assistant, noticed that the dimensions of the cellar didn't match the overall footprint of the house. There appeared to be approximately 15 feet unaccounted for on the east wing. Upon closer inspection, we located a doorway that had been plastered over and painted to match the surrounding wall. The plasterwork was skilled, but had begun to crack with age, revealing the outline of the door. When Wilson and his team broke through the sealed entrance, they discovered a chamber approximately 15 feet by 20 feet, with a ceiling height of 7 feet. Wilson's report, filed with the Chatham County Historical Commission, described the room as meticulously constructed, with ventilation ducts leading to discreet openings near the ground level outside. The floor was covered in slate tiles, with a central drain. The walls had been lined with cork material, apparently for soundproofing. Most disturbing were the iron fixtures embedded in the walls, rings and hooks at various heights, showing considerable wear. The room contained little else. A few wooden crates filled with mildewed fabric, some broken glass bottles, and a metal box containing what appeared to be personal effects: pocket watches, cufflinks, a few rings, and several wallets containing identification papers too damaged by moisture to be fully legible. The discovery prompted a limited archaeological excavation of the estate grounds. Dr. Lawrence Martin, who led the survey team from the University of Georgia, documented the findings in a report that was archived but never published. According to Martin's notes, retrieved by this program's research team, the investigation revealed a narrow trench approximately 6 feet deep, located in what would have been the estate's ornamental garden. The soil composition suggests multiple diggings over a period of years. Recovered items include bone fragments later confirmed to be human, personal effects similar to those found in the hidden room, and, most notably, iron restraints of unusual design, similar to standard manacles, but lined with a softer material, possibly to prevent obvious marking of the skin. The most revealing document came from an unexpected source. During the cataloguing of Elizabeth Harwood's business records for preservation in the Georgia Historical Society, an archivist discovered a small, leather-bound book hidden in the false bottom of a document box. The book, written in Elizabeth's precise handwriting, contained what appeared to be coded entries spanning from 1836 to 1842. Dr. Margaret Wilson, a historian specializing in 19th-century ciphers, spent 8 months decoding the journal. Her findings were deemed too disturbing for public release in 1965, but academic access was granted in 1986. The journal revealed Elizabeth's carefully documented experiments with what she termed willing subjects, men she had selected, seduced, and eventually brought to her estate for extended periods of confinement. Elizabeth's writings suggest that she viewed these activities not as crimes, but as a form of psychological research. One partially decoded entry, dated November 1839, reads, "Subject T continues to exhibit the fascinating duality I have observed in all men of certain standing. In public, commanding and assured. In private confinement, reduced to begging. Even when offered release, he chose to remain under conditions of my design rather than face the humiliation of his true nature being exposed. The human will is far more malleable than philosophers suggest, particularly when shame and pleasure are skillfully balanced." What makes Elizabeth's case particularly disturbing is not just the nature of her actions, but the calculated rationality with which she approached them. According to her journal, she selected her subjects based on specific criteria. Men of social standing with no close family connections in the area, often widowers or bachelors whose extended absences would not immediately raise alarms. She established relationships over a period of weeks, assessing their psychological profiles before bringing them to her estate's hidden chamber. Most chilling is her documentation of how long each man survived under her care, ranging from several weeks to, in one case, nearly 7 months. Elizabeth's final journal entry was dated April 30th, 1842. It reads simply, "The constraints of this environment have become too limiting for further meaningful observation. I have accepted an offer for the purchase of this property and will continue my research in a setting with fewer restrictions." County records confirm that Elizabeth Harwood sold her estate in May 1842 to a merchant from Charleston and departed Savannah. Passenger manifestos show that a woman matching her description boarded a ship bound for Liverpool, England, in June of that year. Despite efforts by researchers following the discovery of her journal, no definitive record of Elizabeth Harwood's activities or fate after leaving America has been established. The investigation into Elizabeth Harwood's activities was complicated by the passage of time and the incomplete nature of 19th-century record-keeping. The total number of victims remains unknown, though forensic analysis of the remains found on the property suggested at least 7 individuals, all male, ranging in age from approximately 25 to 50 years. Cause of death could not be conclusively determined due to the condition of the remains, though evidence of malnutrition was present in several cases. What distinguished Elizabeth's case from other historical crimes was the apparent contradiction between her public persona and private activities. Reverend Whitaker's journals, which covered the entire period of Elizabeth's residence in Savannah, contain numerous references to her charitable works, including donations to the orphanage and regular visits to the city almshouse. A letter from the director of the Savannah Ladies' Aid Society, dated January 1841, praises Elizabeth for her generous spirit and unwavering moral character. This duality allowed her to operate without suspicion for years, using her reputation as a respectable widow as the perfect cover for her activities. The hidden chamber itself revealed Elizabeth's methodical approach. The architectural analysis conducted in 1964 determined that the room had been incorporated into the original house design, not added later, suggesting that Franklin Harwood may have been aware of, or even complicit in, his wife's intentions from the beginning. The ventilation system was sophisticated for its time, allowing for air circulation without providing any means of communication with the outside world. The cork lining, imported from Spain according to shipping records, effectively muffled sounds. Most disturbing was the discovery of a concealed observation port in the connecting wall, allowing someone in the adjacent storage room to watch the occupant of the chamber undetected. The psychological impact on the community when these discoveries became public was significant. A feature in the Savannah Morning News from October 1965 described the collective shudder that passed through local historical circles as the full extent of Elizabeth's activities became clear. The article quoted an elderly resident who recalled her grandmother's stories about Elizabeth Harwood. She was always described as the perfect Southern lady, composed, intelligent, never a hair out of place. To think that behind that facade was, well, it makes you wonder how many other secrets these old houses keep. In 1967, a limited excavation was conducted on the grounds of Elizabeth's former townhouse in Savannah. While no human remains were discovered, archaeologists found a hidden sub-basement room similar in design to the chamber at the Plantation, though smaller and less elaborate. City records indicated that Elizabeth had commissioned substantial renovations to the property in 1838, shortly before the period when Thomas Wright and the other victims were first documented visiting her residence. The townhouse had been destroyed in a fire in 1923, and the property redeveloped several times since, complicating the investigation. The most unsettling aspect of Elizabeth Harwood's case is perhaps not what is known, but what remains unknown. Her journal entries, while explicit about her methods, never clearly state her motivations. Psychological analyses conducted in the 1960s suggested possibilities ranging from a pathological need for control, stemming from her restricted role as a woman in 19th century society, to a genuine belief that she was conducting important research into human nature. Dr. James Hoffman, a criminal psychologist who reviewed the case in 1968, wrote, "What makes Harwood unique among historical cases of serial predators is her apparent lack of sadistic pleasure in her subject's suffering. Her notes read more like a scientist's observations than a record of personal gratification. This clinical detachment is, in its way, more disturbing than emotional rage or desire." Local lore surrounding the Harwood case has grown over the decades. Tour guides in Savannah occasionally reference the lady collector in their ghost tours, though the historical facts have been distorted through retelling. The Harwood estate itself was never rebuilt after its demolition in 1965. The land remained vacant until 1981, when it was incorporated into a highway expansion project. Some construction workers reported unusual equipment malfunctions and inexplicable cold spots during the excavation, though such claims are common in a city as steeped in supernatural folklore as Savannah. In 1958, 5 years before the discovery of the hidden chamber, a linguistics professor from Emory University named Dr. Catherine Reynolds was researching Southern women's writing of the 19th century when she came across a series of academic articles published in British medical journals between 1843 and 1849. The articles focused on the psychological effects of isolation and dependency, were authored by an E.C. Harwood, and described experiments that, while not explicitly illegal, pushed the boundaries of ethical research for the era. Reynolds noted the articles in her research, but made no connection to Elizabeth Harwood of Savannah. It wasn't until 1969, when a graduate student researching the Harwood case discovered Reynolds' papers, that the possible link was established. Attempts to track Elizabeth's movements in England based on publication locations suggested she had spent time in Edinburgh, Cambridge, and London, always in proximity to medical research communities. The final article appeared in 1849, after which the author disappeared from academic records. The last confirmed document potentially connected to Elizabeth Harwood is a patient admission record from a private sanitarium outside Paris, dated June 1852. The patient, identified as Madame E.C.H., American expatriate, aged approximately 55 years, was admitted for nervous exhaustion and delusional tendencies. The attending physician noted that the patient speaks lucidly on matters of science and philosophy, but harbors disturbing notions regarding human will and autonomy that suggest a mind operating beyond conventional moral constraints. The patient remained at the facility until October 1853, when she was transferred to another institution. No further records have been located. What remains most disturbing about the case of Elizabeth Harwood is how effectively she manipulated the social expectations of her era to conceal her activities. As Dr. Margaret Wilson observed in her analysis of Elizabeth's decoded journal, Harwood understood that a widow of means was simultaneously visible and invisible in 19th century society. Visible enough to move through respectable circles without suspicion, yet invisible enough that her private activities drew little scrutiny. She exploited the period's rigid gender roles, knowing that no one would suspect a refined Southern lady of such calculated violence. This observation raises uncomfortable questions about how social constraints and expectations can provide cover for those who understand how to manipulate them. The Harwood case has been largely forgotten outside academic circles, overshadowed by more sensational historical crimes. Yet it offers a unique window into how a predator could operate within the structured society of the antebellum South, using the very rules designed to constrain women's behavior as a shield for activities that defied all social norms. Elizabeth Harwood left no known descendants, and her family in Virginia reportedly severed all connections after her departure for England, perhaps aware of rumors that had begun to circulate about the true nature of her research interests. In 1969, a descendant of Thomas Wright, one of Elizabeth's victims whose identity was confirmed through personal effects found in the hidden chamber, visited the former site of the Harwood estate. According to a local newspaper account, Wright's great-granddaughter stood at the edge of the property for nearly an hour before leaving without comment. She later told a reporter, "There's nothing to say, no justice possible after so much time, but I wanted to stand where he stood, to acknowledge that his disappearance wasn't forgotten. Every victim deserves at least that much." Today, the story of Elizabeth Harwood serves as a reminder of how easily appearances can deceive, and how the most disturbing predators are often those who understand precisely how to conform to social expectations while violating its most fundamental taboos. As one investigator noted in the final report on the case, filed with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation in 1969, what is perhaps most unsettling about Elizabeth Harwood is not that she was a monster hiding in plain sight, but that she was intelligent, methodical, and patient enough to create a life that allowed her to indulge her darkest impulses without detection. One wonders how many others, throughout history and perhaps even today, have learned the same lesson, that the perfect disguise is often no disguise at all, but rather the meticulous adoption of society's most respected roles. If you visit Savannah today and walk past Oglethorpe Square, you might notice a small historical marker that makes no mention of Elizabeth Harwood or her crimes. The plaque simply notes that the site once held a townhouse belonging to a prominent plantation owner's widow, known for her contributions to local charitable causes. Some secrets, it seems, remain too disturbing to commemorate, even in a city that has built much of its tourism industry around its dark history and haunted reputation. And perhaps that silence is fitting, not as a means of forgetting, but as an acknowledgement that some aspects of human behavior remain inexplicable, even after more than a century of study and analysis. In 1968, the Georgia Historical Society debated whether to include Elizabeth Harwood's journals and case files in their public archives. After considerable discussion, the materials were classified as restricted access, available only to qualified researchers with legitimate academic purposes. The committee's decision statement noted, "While historical truth must be preserved regardless of its disturbing nature, there is a difference between preservation and promotion. These documents will be maintained for their historical significance, but without the public exhibition that might be perceived as celebrating or sensationalizing acts of extraordinary cruelty." This policy remains in effect today, ensuring that Elizabeth's story is neither forgotten nor exploited. And what of the hidden chamber itself, the space where Elizabeth enacted her disturbing experiments? Before the estate's demolition, complete architectural drawings and photographs were made for the historical record. The room's dimensions, features, and materials were catalogued with scientific precision. Yet no amount of documentation could capture what one archaeologist described as the palpable sense of suffering that lingered in that space. The surveyor who first discovered the chamber refused to enter it a second time, delegating the documentation work to his assistants. In his personal notes, later donated to the Historical Society, he wrote, "I have worked in abandoned prisons, ancient tombs, and battlefield sites throughout my career, yet never encountered a space that so immediately communicated malevolence. It was as though the walls themselves had absorbed the intentions of their creator. The chamber, like the woman who designed it, had maintained its secrets for over a century, revealing them only when time had rendered justice impossible. As for Elizabeth Harwood herself, her ultimate fate remains unknown. If the sanitarium patient outside Paris was indeed Elizabeth, then her story ended far from the society she had so skillfully manipulated, confined perhaps by the same type of institutional control she had imposed on others. It would be a fitting symmetry, though history rarely provides such neat moral conclusions. More likely, Elizabeth simply disappeared into the anonymity possible in 19th century Europe, perhaps continuing her research in new settings, perhaps not. The woman who had been so meticulous in documenting her activities in Savannah left no further record for history to judge. In the end, the case of Elizabeth Harwood, the plantation mistress who kept her lovers in chains, serves as a disturbing reminder that evil often wears the most respectable face, and that the darkest human impulses can hide behind the most impeccable social credentials. In a city known for its ghost stories, hers is not a tale of supernatural horror, but something perhaps more unsettling. The horror of rational, calculated human cruelty, executed with patience, intelligence, and perfect social grace. And that, perhaps, is why her story continues to unsettle those who encounter it, not because it is fantastical, but because it is entirely disturbingly plausible. Somewhere in the archived records of the Georgia Historical Society, Elizabeth's coded journal remains, its faded pages preserving the methodical documentation of her experiments. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirits of those who suffered in her hidden chamber still wait for a justice that will never come, their stories preserved only as footnotes to the larger mystery of the woman who selected, confined, and ultimately discarded them in pursuit of her own disturbing vision of human nature. Their silence echoes across the years, a reminder that some historical truths remain just beyond our understanding, hidden behind walls both literal and metaphorical, waiting for time or chance to finally bring them to light. Perhaps most disturbing are the few surviving fragments of Elizabeth's methodology, preserved in her coded journal. According to Dr. Wilson's analysis, Elizabeth had developed a systematic approach to breaking down her subjects' resistance. She began with disorientation, keeping them in darkness, altering meal times randomly, creating irregular patterns of interaction that prevented them from maintaining any sense of time. She followed this with isolation, allowing days to pass without human contact. Then came what she termed the reconstruction phase, carefully orchestrated interactions where she positioned herself as both tormentor and savior, the only source of human comfort in an otherwise empty existence. One entry, dated January 18, 1840, details this process with clinical precision. Subject F has progressed to the third stage more rapidly than previous subjects. After 16 days of adjusted conditioning, he now exhibits physical tremors when left alone for more than 6 hours. Upon my entrance to the chamber, his relief is palpable, despite knowing I am the architect of his confinement. The contradiction appears to create significant cognitive dissonance, which furthers the dependency. When offered simple comforts, his gratitude is disproportionate to the gesture. Tomorrow, I will begin the loyalty assessments. These loyalty assessments, as described in later entries, involved offering the victim opportunities to escape or call for help, knowing that by this point, most had become too psychologically dependent on Elizabeth to take advantage of them. Those who did attempt escape were subjected to what Elizabeth called reset protocols, extended periods of complete sensory deprivation followed by reintroduction to the conditioning process. According to her notes, only 2 subjects ever reached this stage. The fate of these men is not explicitly stated in the recovered portions of the journal, though the human remains discovered on the property may provide the answer. In April 1841, Elizabeth noted a growing concern about maintaining her operation in Savannah. The limitations of this location become increasingly apparent. While society's willful blindness has served my purposes admirably, the practical constraints of managing the estate while continuing my research create unnecessary complications. Subject H requires more frequent monitoring than my public obligations allow, and the risk of discovery, while minimal, cannot be discounted indefinitely. European opportunities warrant serious consideration. This entry coincides with correspondence between Elizabeth and several academic contacts in London and Edinburgh, preserved in the University of Edinburgh archives. These letters, discovered during an unrelated research project in 1970, show Elizabeth inquiring about research positions and private funding opportunities in medical psychology, a field still in its infancy in the mid-19th century. Her academic references came from respected physicians in Charleston and Philadelphia, suggesting that Elizabeth had cultivated a network of professional connections entirely separate from her Savannah social circle, men who knew her as a serious intellectual rather than a plantation widow. The dual nature of Elizabeth's existence extended beyond her criminal activities. County records from 1838 show that she petitioned the court for unusual legal privileges normally reserved for men, including the right to execute contracts without male oversight and expanded property management authority. The judge's decision, preserved in court archives, granted these requests based on character references from prominent community members, and Elizabeth's demonstrated exceptional competence in business affairs following her husband's untimely demise. This legal autonomy gave Elizabeth freedoms few women of her era enjoyed, allowing her to operate with minimal supervision or questioning. What made Elizabeth's case particularly effective as a cover was her careful adherence to social norms in all visible aspects of her life. Church attendance records show she never missed Sunday services unless traveling. Household accounts reveal generous but not excessive charitable giving. Her clothing expenditures, documented in dressmaker receipts, show a preference for quality materials in appropriately subdued styles suitable for a widow of her standing. Even her limited social engagements followed the expected pattern for a woman in her position. As one contemporary, Mrs. Eleanor Prescott, wrote in her social diary in 1840, "Mrs. Harwood maintains the perfect balance, visible enough to avoid unfortunate gossip, reserved enough to honor her widowed state." Other bereaved ladies would do well to observe her dignified example. The discovery of Elizabeth's hidden chamber in 1963 prompted renewed interest in similar historical cases. Architectural historian Dr. Robert Chambers published a study in 1967 documenting 17 other examples of concealed rooms in pre-Civil War Southern mansions, though most appeared to have been constructed as hiding places for valuables or, in some cases, as emergency shelters. Only 3 showed evidence of having been designed for human confinement, and none with the sophisticated features of Elizabeth's chamber. Chambers' conclusion, widely cited in subsequent criminological literature, was that the Harwood case represents not a common practice inadequately documented, but rather a genuinely anomalous example of premeditated criminal infrastructure rarely seen before the 20th century. The question of whether Elizabeth acted alone has been debated by historians and criminologists since the case came to light. While no definitive evidence of accomplices exists,